Welcome back to Kearsarge Valley Magazine. Again, I'm joined by Don Wright. Thank you, Don, for being here with us. And
Thank you.
Appreciate Don's sharing his story with us, which is an amazing story that he has recorded in his new book, Life is a Piece of Cake. And last week, we talked about the moment when they asked you to become a U-2 pilot, a spy plane. 70,000 feet, as I remember you said, that's how high it flew, which no one thought would be possible, but it was made possible. And what an amazing, difficult plane this is to fly. And I'm going to start today with a little paragraph in your book that you wrote, and then you tell me about that experience. It says, just a short hour earlier, I'd slipped above 60,000 feet, received clearance from air traffic control for VFR, Visual Flight Rules, and clicked off the radio. As I climbed above 70,000 feet, I could almost count the revolutions of the Pratt & Whitney jet engine as it ticked over. Otherwise, the silence was absolute. I was as alone as I'd ever been, though it occurred to me that at that moment I was probably physically closer to God than any human on the planet. Do you remember that moment?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you do. Yeah. Incidentally, when we talked last week, when I was talking about Colonel Olson, when he also sent me many of the pictures that are in that book, and we also chatted a little bit about that, about being so alone up there.
How can you even describe that experience?
That was the only time I really had that kind of time to even think of that sort of thing. It's a busy mission.
Yeah.
It was flown on an autopilot, had to be. The most hazardous thing about, one of the more hazardous things about flying the U-2 is it had about a 6-knot window that you had to stay in, 6 miles an hour, a little over 6 miles an hour. If you went over that, you went into what's known as a stall, and the aircraft would disintegrate. And if you went below that, if you went over that, it would go into what they call Mach, which is too fast and it would disintegrate, and too slow, it would go into a stall and disintegrate. So you had to be on autopilot, and it took your entire concentration. I don't think I've ever been so focused in all my life as when I got up there.
Yeah.
Now because the autopilot was set just so you could maintain this window. But when the autopilot came off, which happened occasionally, you had your hands full.
I bet. I mean, that's like, we can sort of imagine with a car, if we had to keep it at exactly 55 miles an hour, how much you'd be watching that speedometer every second.
Yeah,
but in a plane going those speeds.
Yeah, and that's, a car's a nice analogy. When you put it on cruise control, it pretty much stays there.
Right.
So it was, yes, it was a window you had to stay in, but it did keep your attention. And that first flight was kind of a sightseeing flight. It was it's learning to creep and then walk, and now I was up to where the airplane was born to fly, and you're sightseeing, and I was just kind of enjoying myself, looking over the rail, and I only had about an hour to cruise around up there and pretty much do as I wished, and then I started back, and to descend was probably the more difficult thing to do, because if you put the nose down, it wanted to exceed the speed, the placarded speed. So we lowered the landing gear and put out what's known as speed brakes, which come out from there and hold you back a little so that you could descend. But from 70 or 75,000 feet, it could take 30 or 45 minutes to get down to what we would call a habitable altitude.
So you had to maintain that speed window that whole time?
As you got lower, that window opened up.
Okay.
So when you got down to 50, 40, 30,000 feet, it was just an airplane.
Okay. But it was the altitude that created that issue.
But during your missions, you didn't have too much time to reflect. You're up there navigating with a sextant. It was a antique that had come out of a B-29, actually. It was remotely controlled. The sextant was in the nose, but controlled through verniers, and you would look through a drift sight. And we had to navigate using that because the Russians, whoever, weren't going to turn on radio aids for us, so you had to use the stars. They couldn't move the stars. or the sun. And the rest of the time, when you got to the target area, you would flip off the sextant and you would look through the drift sight, and it was like a low-level mission. You would follow roads, railroad tracks, highways, mountains, and then because there was no wind up there at all, you're above wind, you're above the atmosphere, that by following the green card, so to speak, it was something that had time hacks on it and turning points. When you'd flip the sextant back on and you'd be looking for a star, 90% of the time there'd be the star.
Oh
or the
my
sun.
goodness.
It was amazing.
You know, there are modern day pilots out there cringing right now at the thought of having to do it that way, because they never have.
I have a GPS on my car that I would have loved to have had.
I bet. I bet.
I always feared the day when I flipped that sextant up and that sun or the star wouldn't be in that window, because we couldn't bring the tablets with us. That had to be pre-computed. And if it wasn't there, you were up a creek. But I was never up a creek. It was okay.
Thank goodness. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about the U-2 and some stories that you have about it. But if you could describe the experience of flying that plane in say 3 words, or even 1 word, what comes to mind?
Oh, it was magnificent.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
Well, we're going to hear about more magnificent U-2 stories next week. Thank you, Don.
Thank you.